Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is a 10-minute Bible Hour podcast. One of the things that I like in some of the long-form storytelling that you get on streaming services and stuff, especially in the golden age of streaming television, which I would consider to be the first half of the 2010s. That's when some of the really awesome stuff happened. I really like the thing in that kind of show where you have enough time to work with the characters that we get to see them flip from being a mess to being a good guy. They get a redemption arc. Something works out. In movies, that 2-hour framework, it just doesn't always give you enough to get that done. I remember the British soldier officer guy in Last of the Mohicans who kind of flipped from the heel to the good guy, and it sort of worked, and you sort of accepted it back then because it's all the more time you had. It's how long movies are. So I'm not saying it never happens in movies, but TV shows lend themselves to this kind of thing. And I always love the process by which I'm like, man, I really don't like that guy, but you're going to make me like him. Oh, come on, you're going to do it, aren't you? And then they flip it around. George R.R. Martin, on the other hand, kind of did a couple tricks where he gave you the redemption arc, flipped it around, and then totally unredeemed it, which I thought was kind of fun in his work as well. But maybe because we're used to those sensibilities, maybe because we are conditioned to think of the story of the characters that we look at throughout the Bible in light of the whole Bible and not just an individual document that makes up part of the Bible, we all think of Peter as getting a really strong redemption story in the Bible, and we would be right. Peter, as we know from the Gospel of John, from the book of Acts, from the rest of the New Testament, I mean, he really blows it here in Matthew, and we just looked at it in 26, but he comes around, he figures it out. But I thought it'd be interesting if we took a look first at the place where we really see that redemption arc specifically play out for Peter in the book of Matthew. I just don't want to leave it on this dark note with him outside weeping bitterly and Matthew's story sort of characterizing him as, like right now, it feels like he's an example of how to get it wrong. It feels like he's the type of soil where the seed hits and it starts to grow, but then the worries of this life choke it out, and it looks promising at first and it doesn't work out. And I know we've got a couple chapters to go, but I want to skip ahead to the other parts of Matthew where Peter is specifically mentioned so that we can relieve this tension early and not leave poor Peter, who we relate to so much, sitting there outside weeping impotently and bitterly. So let's just go to the next part of Matthew where Peter gets mentioned. Oops. Well, now I'm into Mark. It must be back here somewhere. Let me just, only a couple of pages skimming. It's all shtick. I don't mean it. Surprise. I knew before I even turned on this microphone that Peter doesn't come up again specifically at all in the book of Matthew. I fooled dozens of you. He's not in there. That's it. That's where we leave Peter. I'm not kidding. That's the end for Peter. Now, I mean, I assume that he's there in Matthew 28 when all of this shakes out and Jesus is risen and people who follow Jesus figure that out. But when Jesus is risen from the dead, he doesn't appear to Peter, not according to Matthew. That's not where it all starts. Matthew puts the emphasis in the narrative on appearing to the women. Who's there at the crucifixion? Well, Peter apparently doesn't pivot from crying outside in the darkness to be in there incognito to look out for him. No, Matthew doesn't give us that detail. And the women do. They're faithful and loyal, and they stuck with Jesus even at great risk to the very end. And they are there to receive the blessing of being the ones to find out the good news that Jesus did indeed defeat death. And then the book of Matthew is going to take us up to Galilee, and then Jesus is going to say some stuff. But no, there's nothing here at all about Peter being specifically mentioned as being restored or having his story put back together. Matthew is content to leave the story of Jesus' life and the theological points that Matthew's trying to make with Jesus' life. He's content to leave Peter's conclusion ambiguous. Now, as we're going to see over the next couple of days here, the gap between 26 and 27, editorially, Matthew is arranging some stuff very strategically to contrast Peter and his remorse and what he did with that remorse And where Peter is, I already committed to this in my brain, but it's not an intentional pun. I'm just going to go with it anyway. I'm so sorry to everyone. Where Peter is left hanging versus where, again, I'm sorry, I didn't plan this, where Judas is left hanging at the beginning of chapter 27. So I don't want to give the impression that because Matthew doesn't bring up Peter again specifically, that in Matthew's mind, he's trying to tell the reader, well, Peter, Judas, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, same deal. Well, no, clearly that is not the case. They aren't the same. And I think Matthew is intentionally stacking them up next to each other and how they respond to their betrayal, their failure, as a point of contrast. Heck, maybe Matthew even had in mind that parable of the sower that he spent so much time on, disproportionately much time on, in Matthew chapter 13 in the Kingdom Parables discourse. And maybe he has that in view here, and he's like, oh, this is a different kind of seed and what it might look like. Maybe. That might be a little bit of a stretch. I don't think I'm prepared to defend a thesis like that. But there certainly are smart, sophisticated scholars who are willing to go further than me and say, no, Matthew has a negative view of Peter. He views Peter as a flame that burned hot and then burnt out. He views Peter as a cautionary tale with really no need to give Peter a restoration or a redemption. Now, some of the smart people who make this argument also argue that Matthew, in their estimation, is the first chronologically of the 4 Gospels to have been written. Now, Peter, it's largely assumed, worked in association with Mark, and that Mark is sort of a repetition of Peter's memoirs from later in his life, from speeches or recountings of the story of Jesus that Peter gave. But a lot of people think that Mark was the first one. They call that Markan priority. That's a fancy way to say they thought that Mark was the first one. And so if you assume that Mark was the first gospel and that Matthew and Luke and John all had access to Mark, then you would assume that Matthew and Luke and John just hit the theological points that Mark didn't hit those points of emphasis. They wrote for a different audience because they found the brevity of Mark to not be satisfactory for the people they were trying to persuade about Jesus. Could be. I mean, there's a lot of good reasons to think that. There is, however, a very early church father who we talked about way back at the beginning of this conversation named Papias, who said that Matthew was the first of the Gospels and that he wrote originally in the language of the Hebrew people. If that's the case, and some very fancy scholars argue this, then maybe the other gospel writers felt a need to be like, well, like Peter came around though. Things got better with Peter, and maybe Matthew, they felt just wrote so early that they felt like he left off the story too soon. He didn't get in the details about what happened in Peter's life later. I don't know about that argument. I think it has problems because it sure looks like within days, Peter has got this thing flipped around very publicly, and he's at the day of Pentecost, and he's picking up where Jesus left off and being like, all right, looky here, Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. I mean, it looks like Peter straight up picks up the mantle of exactly the same agenda that Jesus had and that Matthew has in writing this account of Jesus. So even though the people who make the argument that Matthew is being hard on Peter and holding Peter out as an example of a failed disciple, even though they're legitimately smarter and better educated and older than me, and they know the original languages way better than I do, I can't claim expertise over some of the people who make this argument. What I can do is honestly say I don't agree with the argument. I don't think Matthew is trying to leave us with this bad taste in our mouth over Peter. I think Matthew's demonstrating that the very best disciple couldn't even get this right of his own volition. The very, very best disciple was unable to identify Jesus for who he was apart from the revelation of God. Remember in Matthew 16? It's like, wow, yeah, you're the Christ, the Messiah. And Jesus is like, yep, and that was from God. Further, right after that in Matthew 16, Jesus seems to really affirm Peter's role in what's going to happen next with God's redemptive plan after Jesus dies and is resurrected and ascends into heaven. And we don't see Jesus rescind that. He doesn't countermand that order or remove that blessing or break that deal anywhere in the book of Matthew. So just what I'm seeing here from Matthew with his handling of the character arc of Peter, to me, it just seems to rhyme more with what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5 in his first big public speech, the Sermon on the Mount. And you'll recall, he opens with the values of the kingdom. Then people are probably like, whoa, wait, what about the religion we have? I mean, that sounds good, but we have one. And Jesus is like, I'm not abolishing the religion you have. I'm fulfilling it. I'm completing it. I was always the plan, paraphrases mine. And then people no doubt would have been like, well, wait, aren't we already in that kingdom though? Because like we go to the temple and do sacrifices and stuff. And then Jesus indicates that, like, no, true access to this true kingdom is something that would require a righteousness that goes beyond even that of the Pharisees and Sadducees, the people who make the rules. You have to do better than the people who make the rules, and they get to make the rules to get into heaven. Well, seems to me like what Matthew is kind of holding out here is, yeah, and on top of that, even Peter's not good enough. But even the great Peter, the one who's going to play a role in the establishment of this whole kingdom and who's going to be so prominent moving forward, even he isn't good enough as the right-hand man of Jesus, who, happened to abandon him a couple of times and deny him a whole bunch and fight with him a little bit and argue with him. And he wasn't perfect. But even Peter's righteousness is not great enough to secure access to the kingdom on its own merit, on his own merit for himself or for anybody else. So yeah, while it's true, Peter does not come up specifically any further in Matthew. Come on. We are left to assume that Peter would have been there at the end of the book, and I don't want to spoil everything, when there's the big reunion after Jesus' death and resurrection and a commissioning in Matthew 28 that looks a lot like the commissioning that Peter got in Matthew 16, that looks a lot like the commissioning that Peter and the rest of the disciples got in Matthew 10, that looks a lot like the commissioning that Peter got when he was first called in Matthew chapter 4. So, no, there's continuity throughout. I think the most natural read on Matthew is not that Peter's still out in the wilds crying somewhere by the time we get to the end of the book and the final commissioning happens, but rather the more natural read is they all abandoned Jesus. Why is Peter's abandonment worse? No, they all look like clowns. They all bailed out under pressure. They all wilted, but Jesus is still going to use them and he's still going to commission them for stuff. So I wanted to acknowledge that, yeah, it's a little weird that Peter doesn't come back up. It does look like Matthew is doing something in a literary sense by contrasting Peter's bad response and fate with Judas's horrible response to this pressure and fate by rearranging the timeline a little bit to put them right next to each other. But though I have much respect for the people who make such arguments and their competencies that far exceed my own, I'm not convinced on this point that such very smart people are right when they try to say that Matthew is holding out Peter as being an archetype of a failed disciple. They're all failed disciples. Nobody's righteous. Not even one. Nobody is righteous enough to enter the kingdom by their own merit. Jesus has made that clear. So Peter is in the same boat as everybody who isn't righteous enough, and yet it looks like to me, along with all the other not righteous enough disciples, Jesus still has a use for them, a role for them in the kingdom, a big one, and he commissions them to do so. A little bit more on Peter and how the rest of the New Testament shakes out for him, since he's not going to be on screen anymore moving forward. And then we'll get on to 27 and a really grisly, violent passage next. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. We'll do this again soon.